Yeah, my phone's off. Okay, well, thank you. It's an honor to be on this program to celebrate the center and all of the wonderful things you guys have done over the years. And we've heard a lot of incredible data during the course of the day. So I'm going to give you a break. I'm not going to talk about any data. I'm going to tell you about a struggle that I've had for almost 30 years, maybe more than 30 years, about what emotion is and how you can actually do research on that. So maybe it's a kind of lightweight in the afternoon. So why was I interested in emotion over 30 years ago? I mean, I think it's obvious, it's a defining feature of who we are in many ways. A lot of psychopathology is based on emotions, and it's poorly understood. And that was true in 1978, and it's still true today. And so I think, part of the problem is we don't really know what we're doing, and that gets in the way. So the work I've done has focused on a specific kind of a behavioral model, you might say, of emotion, which is classical fear conditioning. We've learned a lot about the behavioral mechanisms, the neural circuits, the cells and synapses and molecules involved. So we know a lot about this stuff. But then, what you want to ask is, how does this really relate? What does a freezing rat really tell us about the human emotion, fear, or any other human emotions? And that's where the problems come in. But I think it can tell us a lot if we have some understanding of what we're doing. So what I want to just start with is how my struggle with the semantic issue has helped me or led me to think about emotion differently and to think about the work I've done for the past 30 years differently. So what I want to start with is this picture here, which shows the way a lot of people think about what I've done, which is that I've been studying the way a threat is processed by, say, the amygdala, and that produces these fear responses, and it also leads to the feeling of fear. But that's really not at all what I've been interested in at all. I've worked on how threat activates the amygdala and produces these fear responses. And I've always separated that from the conscious experience of fear and said that we really don't know what a rat feels, if anything. And we certainly don't think that the amygdala is creating or unleashing fear when it's activated, at least not directly. And so a more accurate representation of what I've been doing is something like this with a little more detail. But the problem and the mistake I made in overall this time was calling these fear responses and calling this the fear system. So it's partly my problem, my fault that I'm having this problem, because I wanted to get away from the idea of fear as the experience, but I kept calling it the fear system. So that was kind of confusing. It's natural that people, especially lay people and journalists, and also a lot of scientists would think that I've been studying fear when I haven't really been studying fear, but again, it's partly my fault. So the way to think about this more appropriately, I think, is to think of these as defense reactions controlled by threats, and not really to call this the fear system, but a threat defense system. And my lab has struggled with this because now they're talking about threat conditioning and defense conditioning. It's like awkward for them, but they're coming around and kind of getting to it a little bit. And a lot of this was sort of, my guts were spilled out in the pages of Neuron in February, where I kind of laid all this out. I think I understand it a little better than I did then, so if you read this and were confused, maybe I'm getting a little better now, but probably still have a long way to go before I'm there. But interest in emotion has been exponential over the past, since the 60s. And the problem is, it's not really defined. Most of the papers that study emotion don't really tell you what they're studying or what they're talking about. They assume that you have some idea of what emotion is, and we all do have some idea. But how can you study that if you don't know? It's often said that everyone knows what emotion is until they're asked to define it, and then they sort of like mumble something and they're confused about it. So, in neuroscience, we depend on this kind of psychological conceptualization to study the brain. But if we don't have a good conception, how can we study it? Well, basically, we fake it. So we use our introspections to tell us that some states that we experience have this feeling associated with them. We call those emotions. And we use all these words, fear, anger, love, jealousy, and so on, to use as guideposts when we're exploring the terrain of emotion in the brain of humans or animals. So, this is a standard view of some pretty typical emotions that are talked about as being innate emotions in the human brain that are hardwired, expressed the same way around the world and so forth. But the wisdom of using these words as guides for studying emotion has been questioned by a lot of people over the years. But whatever problems there are in doing this with humans, they're compounded many, many-fold if we're trying to do this in animals. So do rats have love and sadness and surprise and anger and joy and so forth? I really don't think they do. I'm not saying they have no feelings, but they don't have these things that these English words imply in our minds. If they have something else, it's going to be, the rat version of this, like Thomas Nagel's famous article, "What is it like to be a bat?" Well, it's like being a bat. It's not like anything else. So we can't use our language to go searching for things in the brain. Why would our language, which emerged, in recent evolutionary time, be able to an accurate reflection of the way the brain was wired over billions of years of evolution? So, here's some, So, this is absurd, but I'm trying to make these points here. So, the rat and the cat may experience something, but they probably have very little to do with what we call fear and joy. So, I think there are definitely lots of phenomena that are shared by humans and other animals that are relevant to the topic of emotion, but I don't think our subjective experience is the best starting point for figuring out what these are. So what should we do? I think what we have to do is separate the phenomena that are of interest to us from the overarching concept of emotion. The concept of emotion, I'm trying to make the point here, has sort of held us back a lot. So what are the key phenomena? So responses that occur when an organism faces challenges and opportunities. That's the key thing, I think. Situations in which survival or well-being is potentially compromised or enhanced. So here are some examples. So challenges, you face a predator. Opportunities, you have a chance to escape. Low energy supplies, you have food. It doesn't have to be low energy. Food could be attractive just because of its incentive value. Many of these situations have high incentive value as well. Fluid imbalance, drinking, hypothermia, warmth, reproductive isolation, the exposure to a potential mate, and so forth. So we have these fundamental systems that are controlled by highly conserved circuits in the mammalian brain: defense systems, energy, nutrition management, fluid balance systems, thermoregulation, reproduction. And these systems are engaged to control behavioral interactions with the environment when the organism faces these challenges and opportunities. So if this is familiar, we've seen some of this already today, how things are conserved across many levels of evolution. Here's energy and nutritional demands, the conservation of that, the hormones, the circuits. Here's sexual behavior, hormone circuits, and so forth. We already talked about the threat defense system. My colleagues in Spain have worked all this out on the basis of the anatomy and behavior that we did in rodents and identified areas in the reptilian brain that have the similar connections and perform similar functions. Now, we heard some about the role of the medial amygdala today in innate defensive responses. But what I want to point out is that there are multiple so-called fear or defense circuits in the brain. So the one on the right here is the one we've been talking about so far that my work has been based on. But the innate system is, while it is superficially similar, it involves the amygdala. It involves different parts of the amygdala. It critically involves the hypothalamus, which the learned fear system doesn't. And it involves a different part of the PAG than the learned system does. But in both cases, you have innate responses that are expressed either on the basis of learning or on the basis of an innate stimulus. But the circuits are not exactly the same. So one isn't a fear system and the other something else. They're both sort of defense systems And we could probably come up with many others. And there are many instances of fear that have nothing to do with any of this. The fear of falling in love, or the fear of taking an exam, or the fear of being afraid, the fear of the eventuality of death, and other kinds of existential fears. So fear is a big word that takes us into lots of territory that has nothing to do with these basic mechanisms that evolution has put in the brain that helps an animal survive in the presence of a threat. Now, we have to distinguish the behavior from the circuit. Obviously, the behavioral response itself hasn't been conserved over evolution. This is the lordosis posture in a female rat, which is required for her to get pregnant. Primates don't require this. They do it different ways, and humans do it all sorts of ways. So it's not the behavior that's conserved, it's the circuit that is maintaining that behavior and that function over levels of evolutionary history. So the survival phenomena are closely associated with emotion, and behavioral tests use these to assess the various emotions. But I think it's important to note that these phenomena would be of interest even if we never heard of the word emotion or feelings. They're important for understanding certain emotions, but they aren't basically emotional phenomena, is what I'm saying, that these circuits and behaviors existed probably before the brain could feel what it's doing or be conscious of what it's doing, and at least in the way that humans think of consciousness. So some examples of why I think this is important to separate. Well, we know that humans can detect and respond to so-called emotional stimuli without being aware of the stimulus and without feeling anything. So there's not an automatic coupling that occurs between the hardwired responses and the subjective feeling. This also occurs in the area of pain, where the subjective sense of pain is processed separately than the nociceptive processing that ultimately contributes to that. In the addiction literature, we know that drug-seeking and taking behavior can be distinguished from the subjective feelings that can result from taking the drugs. So feelings are correlated with these states, but they're not. The states are not causally connected with feelings in that sense. So this conceptual linkage of emotion with basic mechanisms that underlie these behavioral interactions with the environment when the organism is faced with a challenge or an opportunity, I think has hijacked our understanding of these basic behavioral functions and the mechanisms that are involved in these. So here's a simple proposal. Behavioral responses associated with defense and so forth, reproduction, thermoregulation, fluid balance, can be expressed in species-specific ways. The function, though, is conserved, not the behavior. The function is conserved by the conservation of circuits. The behavior can be used to assess when the survival circuit is active, but is not really a proxy for feelings. Survival responses can be triggered without awareness, as I just described, and without feelings. So all animals have to solve these problems, not just mammals, not just vertebrates, not just invertebrates, but also single-cell organisms. So here's bacteria living in a petri dish, and if you squirt some acid in there, they move away. So they have these little flagella, and they wiggle them, and they can get themselves out of the way. They also will they have to take in nutrients from their environment. They have to thermoregulate, they balance their fluids, and they reproduce by dividing. So all of these things, these functions we're talking about are not emotional functions. These are part of being alive. It's part of what an organism has to do, regardless of how simple or complex it is, to stay alive in the world. So here's another absurd example. People do the same thing, right? So do the bacteria and the people feel the same thing? Obviously not. So again, it's not about the behavior, it's not about the feeling, it's about the function that keeps an organism, no matter how simple or complex, alive. So there are a lot of differences, of course, between humans and bacteria, and all of you know all of this quite well, but if we just focus on animals as opposed to bacteria and other animal kingdoms, We know that an animal is a complex organism with multiple systems that have to be integrated, and of course the function of the nervous system, one of the functions of the nervous system is to integrate all these things and keep them in homeostatic balance and keep the organism alive. So if we look at the nervous systems of different kinds of animals, invertebrates have lots of different nervous systems, but vertebrates have a relatively common nervous system. And all those survival circuit things that we've been talking about show some degree of conservation across all these vertebrate brains. So, but what about the conservation across other groups of animals? So how is this conserved in invertebrates and vertebrates? So we know that, for example, common mechanisms of defense conditioning and aplesia in mammals involve very similar kinds of signaling pathways. This is a general model of conditioning, and the molecular mechanisms involved in a review by David Glanzman, showing molecules that are common to both mammals and invertebrates. Seth Grant has recently published some interesting work on the evolution of synapses, and what you can see here, there are signaling and structural components of synapses that are conserved across invertebrates and vertebrates, and even across, there are components of synapses, or building blocks of synapses that are conserved even across non-animal species. So there's a lot of conservation of these basic mechanisms. Obviously, if functions are being conserved in the presence of different molecules and different circuits, there has to be something that's doing it, and obviously it must be some kind of genetic encoding that goes back to the earliest forms of life, or at least that were triggered and initiated in these early life forms and conserved all the way through evolutionary history. So I'm going to begin to wrap up. This is a relatively short talk, so I won't keep you from the cocktails very much longer. Emotions are feelings. Feelings are conscious experiences. The feelings that occur when we're faced with these, the threat, for example, is not fundamentally different from the feeling that occurs in a situation of pride, envy, or jealousy. Sometimes we distinguish these basic emotions like fear, anger, and so forth, sorrow, happiness, from the more socially based emotions, or complex emotions as they're sometimes called, like jealousy and envy and pride and so forth. But the struggle has always been, what is it that makes these hardwired emotions fall into the same conceptual space as these other things? And I think what makes them fall into the same conceptual space is that they're felt. It's not because the fact that some involve these survival circuits and others don't is not the key thing. The different emotions, I think, probably come about due to non-emotional ingredients. So we have all sorts of things that the brain is using that we often associate or call emotional mechanisms, like these survival circuits are typically called emotional or motivational systems, but they're really just life-sustaining systems. The arousal system is sometimes talked about as important in emotion, and it is, but it's not in the nervous system to make emotions. It's in the nervous system to regulate neuronal function in widespread areas. Same thing with body feedback. Sensory and motor functions probably evolved to help animals survive by taking in information from the environment and responding to it. And one of the kinds of sensory information that the body has and uses is sending stuff back to the brain once you're reacting to something. And this is a very important thing in emotion, but it's not an emotional process. It's something that the body simply has that's used in emotion. And same thing with cognition. We talk about appraisal as being very important in emotional construction. But again, cognition is not necessarily in the brain to make feelings. It's in the brain to help you analyze the world. So let me just wrap up with a few bullet points here. Brain circuits involved in key survival functions are highly conserved in mammals. Included are these things I've already talked about many times. These circuits and their functions are organized similarly in spite of the fact that they control different behaviors in different species. when one of these circuits is activated, a global synchronization or monopolization of brain resources occurs to enhance survival. I didn't really talk about this, but I think this is an important point, that in an emotional state, the brain is monopolized by that state. And one of the things that helps it do this are these monoamines that Corey and others talked about today that are conserved across many levels of evolutionary history. So when we're in these states, the whole organism is engaged and involved. Now, the presence of one of these states, though, is not enough to give you a feeling. Somebody has to be home to answer the door to that feeling. If nobody's watching that feeling, then it's not going to be felt. At least that's what I'm thinking these days. So the circuits evolved not to create feelings, but to perform these survival functions. The global activity triggered by activation of these circuits contributes to feelings. The feelings occur when consciousness witnesses one of these global states. The nature of feelings is a function of the kind of conscious capacity the organism has, with the possibilities ranging from none to a lot, and we won't say where things land in between, because I don't think anyone knows. The particular circuit that's active can instantaneously be overridden by other circuits, so defense can trump feeding, but if deprivation is severe, then feeding has to override defense. You have to go out and look for food. So circuits can also be partly active and inhibited and coactive and so forth. So that's what I wanted to talk about, and thank you for your attention, and happy birthday to the Institute.
Okay, we take questions.
Thank you very much. Interesting talk. My impression is that, there's a change in language or semantics. For instance, historically, if you look back in the DSM, in the old day, we separate the mood disorder with the thought disorder and the feeling, affective disorder versus the cognitive, this regulation. But one thing really shocked me is that when I was at NIH Building 10, we don't do, well, some do the rodent, but we inject, IV, the CCK octopeptide, a small cholestin, peptide, into the healthy, normal college student, people volunteer or pay for it. And you see that college student, suddenly drop into anxiety in front of you just because of that molecule, CCK8. It's almost like context independent. No environmental, clue.
Right.
I wonder, that kind of built-in, molecular circuitry or whatever you name it, had a, cognitive component to evaluate it. In one sense, I agree with you, the, emotion, feeling are two different, semantics when you talk about the difference. But, my impression is that the affective component of your feeling or emotion cannot be separate from the cognitive evaluation.
That's exactly what I was saying. Sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. But yes, so I think, for example, if you inject these peptides and so forth, you're going to activate these circuits, and then you're going to experience it through your cognitive capacities. I mean, I have more slides that address this. So that's kind of how I think the feelings come about. So you have inputs coming into a structure like the amygdala that are activating the PAG and other brainstem areas that produce the responses, but also activating monoamines that are being widely distributed throughout the system. You're having feedback from all of the responses going back to the cognitive areas that allow you to experience all of the stuff that's happening. So the chemicals can act totally down here. I mean, they may act up here as well, but what they would do here is enhance attention to all of the stuff happening down below, I would say.
Okay, question?
Thanks, Joe. I've been a big fan of your work for a long time, and you were one of the big people who pushed this idea of emotion, and I'm really curious to know what sparked this reconceptualization. And one difference between the example that you gave about the acid and your beautiful body of work is that when a neutral stimulus is conditioned, then that's going to be something different than a reflex. So, do you want to comment on that?
Well, what stimulated me to rethink this was just, I think the misperception that's out there about, that many people had about, I would always be introduced to saying, he's going to tell us about his work on feelings of fear or, emotions and so forth. And I just didn't know how to get out of it. And then I realized it was really my fault. So that's when I started backtracking, trying to say, well, what have I been studying? And pulling away from the concept of emotion. Not because I don't think emotion is important, because I think all this stuff is important, it contributes to emotion. These ingredients that I was talking about, all these things on this slide, are like ingredients for a soup. You can make a soup with this, you can make different kinds of soup with the same ingredients depending on how you balance what you put in it. Chicken, garlic, salt, carrots, so on. It's a state that's created by all of these things happening. First, you trigger one of these survival circuits, and you have a state. And depending on the parameters of that state across all these various things that you're setting by the activation of this and the environment and all of the other things going on, that's what's going to emerge as the thing that consciousness witnesses. So I think then you asked me about a reflex versus, I wouldn't call the bacteria thing a reflex, because it doesn't, a reflex has to be neural, I would think. But
sure, but something that's conditioned versus something that's learned.
yeah, so learning comes in somewhere in animals. I don't know if, you wouldn't call like tropic responses and adaptive responses to tropism in plants learning, but many of the molecules that we study in mammals and animals are present in plants too. That some of the NMDA receptors and so on. So there's a lot of stuff that's really conserved, and I don't think we pay enough attention to it. And when we do, we often misconceive what it is. We put emotion into some of these more basic mechanisms. If an animal is responding in a certain way, we say, well, it must be feeling X, and I think that's the wrong way to think about it.
I'm wondering what would be the real evolutionary advantage of having these feelings separately compared to the defense responses. If the way in which you are describing it, it looks like it's primarily to drive attention to whatever is happening, and the animal needs attention to continue focusing on that task.
Right, so I think once the feeling is there, then the whole ball game changes. But the purpose of the amygdala is not to make fear. It's to do all this other stuff, and fear is a consequence. And then once you're afraid, then you decide, well, I better, you start running simulations in your mind, you start making decisions about what to do. But I'm talking about what happens in the first, 15 milliseconds of the stimulus here.
One last question in the back.
I can't hear you. Use the mic, please.
Oh. I'm curious if there are reports of people that have the reaction of defense without reporting fear. So like they're having just the first part of the fear response.
Start over. I didn't hear the beginning. So do you mean the point I made about people being able to respond without knowing that they're responding?
No, that they respond, their body respond to the defense, but they don't report that they are felt fear.
Right. So, you can condition people, for example, to a tone paired with a shock or a light stimulus paired with a shock, and then subliminally present that stimulus, and they'll respond, their body will respond to the stimulus, but they won't be aware of the stimulus, and they won't report feeling anything.
Or in pathological cases where
Oh, are there pathological?
Yes.
There must be. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but we all know, I mean, you know, living in Boston or New York, you walking down the street and you jump back and the bus goes flying by. So your body has the ability to detect and respond to threats, and then afterwards you experience the fear.